Добрый вечер, уважаемые участники мастер-класса. Меня зовут Адриан, я являюсь менеджером приемной комиссии школы кино и телевидения «Индустрия». Ну что ж, сегодня мы продолжаем нашу серию мастер-классов от нашей школы с зарубежными кинематографистами, профессорами и преподавателями топовых мировых киношкол. Вот, немного расскажу про нашу школу. «Индустрия». Школа была основана режиссером Федором Бондарчук и также продюсеры кинокомпании «Водород», а это Михаил Врубель и Александр Андрющенко. Также партнером проекта является Национальная медиа-групп. Вот какое наше главное отличие от других школ? Это уникальная для России система обучения, то есть лучшие профессионалы области на практике делятся своим опытом со студентами, знанием, и после окончания курса выпускников ждет обширная программа стажировок. Вот. На данный момент у нас идет набор на очные и онлайн-программы. Из очных программ у нас есть это менеджмент в музыкальном бизнесе, инфлюенс-маркетинг, маркетинг дигитального контента, второй режиссер и VFX, VFX 3D-артист и VFX композитинг. И также звукорежиссура, режиссер монтажа и менеджмент артистов в кино. Что касается онлайн-программ наших, то это у нас, естественно, мы также делаем онлайн, чтобы не только студенты, которые проживают в Москве, могли учиться, но также и студенты, которые живут в других городах. Так что касается онлайн-программы, это у нас продюсирование, режиссура, сценарное мастерство, также монтаж у нас на онлайне есть, также VFX у нас на онлайне есть и филммейкинг. Вот. Ну, возвращаемся к нашему мастер-классу. Значит, наш мастер-класс будет проходить регулярно в ближайший месяц еще. Обычно это по пятницам, но сегодня у нас исключение. Вот. Так что следите за расписанием на нашем сайте и регистрируйтесь. Вот. Сегодня своим опытом работы в сфере VFX как раз-таки поделится Майкл Финк. Значит, Майкл – это знаковая фигура в сфере постпродакшена вообще. Он является обладателем премии «Оскар» за визуальные эффекты в фильме «Золотой компас». Вот, его фильмография включает также фильмы, как многим известно, «Аватар», «Бегущий по лезвию», «Бэтмен. Возвращение», «Жизнь Пи» и «Люди Икс». И также Майкл, он является преподавателем в университете Южной Калифорнии. Вот. Что значит по плану нашего мастер-класса? Это будет идти 1,5 часа, час 15 – это мастер-класс и 15 минут серия вопросов и ответов с подарками от нашей школы по концу мероприятия. Так что оставайтесь с нами на весь период, на ближайшие все эти часы, которые у нас будут проходить. И также задавайте вопросы в чатах. На самые интересные вопросы Майкл с удовольствием ответит в конце мастер-класса. Также в процессе мастер-класса вы можете, как я сказал, задавать вопросы по киношколе, еще также можете задавать по программам весеннего набора, и мы на них с удовольствием ответим. Так что большое спасибо, что все к нам присоединились, и я передаю слово Майклу.
Okay. Well, thank you all for having me here this morning or this evening, and I hope you get something from the discussion today. First, I just want to say a few things about myself so you get an idea of who I am. As you know, name is Michael Fink. I was born in Los Angeles, California, grew up in Los Angeles, had nothing to do with the film industry for many, many years, lived in other states. I lived in Indiana for a short while in the middle of the country. I was in the Army for 3 years and then was stationed in different states during that time, but came back to California, became a money manager in San Francisco, where I was managing the accounts of wealthy individuals and estates and trusts and foundations and groups, people with high value assets. And I did that for a short while, but I really wanted to go to art school, so I enrolled in art school in San Francisco. I got a second bachelor's degree in art, and then moved to Los Angeles, where I got a master's degree at California Institute of the Arts, which was an amazing place to be in 1973, which is when I started there. I got my master's degree there 2 years later in 1975 and worked at CalArts. They hired me back to teach and do some administration work. Mostly it was maintaining relations with the artists who were on the faculty and who we wanted to attract to the faculty, and managing the visiting artist program that we had. So I did that, but it wasn't enough money for me to actually make my own art. And so there I was working every day and not being very creative, and not feeling terribly fulfilled. And I wanted to do something else. And a friend of mine hired me on a movie made in Los Angeles in 1977 and 78 called The China Syndrome, which was about a nuclear power plant that melts down. And then the news coverage of that and the uncovering of all the things that went wrong. And that was a lot of fun and something I'd never done before, and I never understood why I didn't know about this wonderful thing called filmmaking and doing collaborative, creative work with some brilliant people. And I have to say, I got that job. I was hired by a friend, a person who I'd been in college with, and wasn't sure what I was going to do, but he said, I think I really need you, so come on board. So I did, and I went to work the first day. I worked 18 hours the first day, from 6 in the morning till midnight, and then I proceeded to work 18 hours a day, 7 days a week for the next 6 weeks. And I loved every minute. I didn't care. I was so happy. It was such a wonderful thing to do. Filmmaking is an incredible effort. And I didn't care what I was doing. I just wanted to be around those people and that process. And I wanted to see the story unfold. And I wanted to be part of that. And I got so excited that essentially I abandoned my art career and went and dove into working on films. So that was my early career. And then, of course, the first films I worked on beside The China Syndrome were films like Star Trek: The Motion Picture, Blade Runner, in the late 70s and the early 80s. Those were probably the two biggest at that point. And then, went from one thing to the other. My first big break as a visual effects supervisor was on a film called War Games, which is about a young a boy, played by Matthew Broderick, who hacks into a government computer thinking he's doing an online game. Now, we were making this movie in 1982. And the idea of online games was a concept, but not a practice. Nobody could do it. So we had to simulate it all as if it were really working, which we did. That film became my first visual effects supervisor credit. And I had hugely stressful, but I had because I didn't know what I was doing half the time. But I had a wonderful time. I greatly enjoyed the entire process. The first director we had, seems like this is a pattern, but it's not really. First director we had was fired off the show about 2 or 3 weeks into shooting. And they brought in another director, a fellow named John Badham, John was superb. He was a great collaborator and a wonderful director, and the cast was terrific. And we created this war room that simulated what a war, some kind of a war room that doesn't exist now and didn't exist then, with gigantic real-time displays of everything that was going on. And of course, this was during the Cold War. And so there were issues about that. But mostly it was about this it was a coming of age story about the young man who got himself in hot water and then had to figure out how to get himself out. So it was a wonderful film. It did very well. And then I went on from there to work on other films. In 1993, I got nominated for my work on Batman Returns. That was 93. The same year I directed the first Coca-Cola polar bear spot commercial. And the polar bears were fully, and the environment was fully CG. Now this was in 1993. We had to invent how to do 3D fur for this commercial on polar bears. And then of course, fast forward to 2006, and there I am making bears for Golden Compass. So it seems like my life is filled with bears. So that's it. And then my career proceeded through, some wonderful films and some not so wonderful films. I got to do the first 2 X-Men movies. I did Batman Returns. I did Constantin, which I'm about to talk about. And like that and then about 2008, after I finished Constantin and a film called Tropic Thunder, I was hired as the CEO of the North American visual effects part of a company from India called Prime Focus. Now, Prime Focus is now essentially merged with Double Negative, which was a British company. And they do, and have grown hugely. And Double Negative was a really great company and still is. And so the combination of the two has maintained that whole operation as quite a force. But I was proud of the work we did there. We did work on Avatar. We did work on Sucker Punch. We did work on a film called A-Team, which is a regrettable remake of a television show from the 80s, which probably shouldn't have been remade, but there it was. Lots of other films. And highlights of that, I think the highlight of my time there was when I got to work on Tree of Life, which was directed by Terrence Malick. And we were challenged with creating dinosaurs for probably one of the few parts of the film that was actually trying to tell a story. The film sort of has to be viewed a couple of times. If you watch it the first time, you may not have any idea what's going on, but watch it a second time and suddenly everything becomes clear. And it's a wonderful film. But I left Prime Focus at the beginning of 2011 and had been teaching part-time at USC, just one class, one semester a year, one afternoon a week. I mean, it was really a very light touch and dabble into teaching. And I greatly enjoyed it. And a few months after I finished my first semester, the dean of the School of Cinematic Arts at USC offered me a full-time job as a professor there. And I was really unhappy with the films that I was being offered. The scripts were not good. I did not want to be out of the country. It was really the height of studios rushing to make films outside of the United States where it was cheaper. And so, and I had just gotten back really, before I started at Prime Focus, I had just gotten back from 2 years in London on the Golden Compass, and had to arrange moving my family to London for 2 years, had to do all that other stuff. I wasn't eager to do, excuse me, to do that again. And the USC offer looked pretty interesting. So I agreed and became, over the period of the next few years, a tenured professor with an endowed chair. And then I became chair of the department. I was chair of film and television production for 6 years, ran the entire film production program at the University of Southern California. And I stepped down last summer because after 6 years, I was kind of worn out. And it's pretty much like CalArts. I felt like I was not doing anything creative. I was an administrator, and that was fine. And I did well at that job, but I really needed to step back from that. So, so I did in the summer, and I've continued to teach at USC, and now I'm here. So there, now you have my life, and we'll get into the class part of this thing. But just to give you an idea, one thing I should say, my first credit as visual effects supervisor on War Games, I got that job by finding out about the production from a friend of mine who was working on it, going and visiting him. And when I visited him, they called a meeting, and my friend said, "Why don't you come to the meeting? This could be kind of interesting for you." And he wasn't trying to, he was an art director. He didn't have any position to offer me a job. He couldn't do that. And that wasn't why I was there. I was there to visit him. He was a friend. I went in the meeting and participated in the meeting, and I left, and I went home. And the next day, I didn't have a job, and I thought, what am I going to do? And I thought, well, I'll go back to War Games, because that meeting was kind of fun, and maybe I should, try to help them out a bit. So I went back. Within a few days, I found an office with a desk and a phone. And I sat at that desk, and people would ask me to do things. I'd make calls, meetings would come up, I'd go to the meetings, and we talk about how they should produce the visual effects part of the movie, which was actually quite huge. And the way they were initially planning it was not practical at all. It was not going to work. So I felt it was my mission to stay there. I was not being paid. Nobody had hired me. But I did this for about 3 weeks, and I was in a meeting, and the producer said to me, producer of the film, said to me, "Are we paying you?" And I said, "No, you're not." And he said, "Well, we have to fix that." And I got hired. And they called me the visual effects supervisor. And that was my first credit. And that's how I got the job. I just walked in, sat down, and started working until somebody noticed. I don't think you can do that anymore, but it's kind of a wonderful way to really kickstart your career. Okay, we're going to talk first this morning about Constantin. Constantin was a film that I worked on from 2003 to 2005. Quite often my tenure on a film was in the range of 2 years, year and a half to 2.5 years, that kind of a range. So they were pretty lengthy jobs, and this one was that. Let me do a share screen, and I will set up a keynote and go through it. And pardon me if some of the video, this is Zoom, so some of the video may not play very well. It might, let's see how it goes. Okay, so here we go. So I'm going to go there. I'm going to optimize the video clip. I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to hit, there we go. I'm going to hit play, and I'm going to have to change the screen. There we go. And share. So you all should be seeing a essentially black screen, and at the bottom in English, it says discussions about hell. Now, all of this, of course, is in English, so I hope you, those of you who can speak or read English, that would be beneficial, of course, and I'm hoping Sam can help out in some of the other parts. It begins with some footage from the DVD that was the making of the film. And then I'll start talking. So we'll start with that. Oop. There we go.
Early on in my approach to this movie, there was just certain areas that stuck out to me as problematic when sort of starting to come up with concepts for them. And one of them was hell. The original script, hell is a black void, and it was like the ground was like an oil slick, and there were some bones lying around. I thought, that's all been kind of done before. What would make it more relatable? And I thought, because I'm approaching everything in a sort of a realistic way, it'd be really interesting to give a real geography to hell.
Francis had done a lot of visual homework to really set up what he wanted. He showed me pictures, he had a lot of references. He wanted hell to be a freeway from the get-go.
There's also a little bit of a joke of, the LA freeway system being hell.
I had an idea early on about what I thought hell should look like. And in one of my first meetings with Francis and Naomi Shohan, I suggested that hell look like that moment when the heat wave from the nuclear blast hits everything just before the shock wave, which blows it all apart. And when the heat wave hits, things stream off violently, they melt, they catch fire, they start to blow apart, but they aren't really disintegrating until the shock wave hits. And I said, maybe hell is that moment during a nuclear blast, but it lasts forever.
And I thought that was just great. I mean, that just kind of finished it all off. So you just have this insane, super directional wind.
Okay, so that was just an introduction, and that's how we started to invent hell. And these were some of the film clips that I showed Francis Lawrence, the director, so that he got an idea of what I was talking about. That's what happens when the heat wave hits. It literally just fries anything. Of course, things start to catch fire, and they are destroyed within millionths of a second. This is a colorized sky of a mushroom cloud, but I was quite taken with it and with the color and thought that that should be the sky for hell. So I'll show you a sequence from the film in which Constantin, played by Keanu Reeves, goes to hell. He's with the actress Rachel Weisz, and she's needs his help because her sister has died, and she's looking for a solution to that. And she enlists Constantin to get his help. So this starts in her apartment and ends with him coming back out of hell and the whole bit in hell in between. So here we go.
Be careful with that cat.
God, I hate this part.
So by the way, There are large numbers of visual effects in here that you wouldn't think about, like the cat's eyes. It had to be animated, and Rachel's hair. Now we're in hell. So you see the little glass orb that he's carrying. That's a container that has, there it is, with holy water. Of course, Keanu was in front of a giant green screen. You'll see that in a few minutes. And every time he had that little orb out, all it did was refract. It was a lens, and it just showed a big green screen. An interesting problem was putting the environment inside that refracting sphere. This shot was added at the last minute in the movie. And there you go. Constantin came back. He had that little holy water sphere and he smashed it against his chest. And very few people know this, but if you're in hell and you have some holy water and you splash it on yourself, you too can escape from hell. So now I'll show you some of the effects from Constantin, some of the shots.
Close your eyes.
Why?
Suit yourself.
These creatures, I can't seem to stop on a good frame. These creatures were called Seplavites. Not long before I did Constantin, I had been on a trip to Croatia. And while I was in Croatia, a friend brought me to a bar where they were serving a particularly potent alcoholic beverage. And they served it in small little stem glasses that had, but the bottom of the glass was broken off, the stem part. So there was no base to the glass. So you couldn't take a sip of the drink and then put it on the bar. You had to drink all of it before you could set it down, because then it would just fall over and spill. And it was a great way to sell drinks, I'm sure, and a great way to have a party, I suppose. And so I had the idea that I pitched to Francis that the Seplavites, these creatures that Keanu is destroying right here, were poor, pitiful things that could never stop flying. Their particular place in hell was they just had to remain in flight all the time because they had no lower torso and they had nothing upon which, with which they could rest. So then at one point, Francis gets attacked. Constantin gets attacked by a creature that we called the Vermin Man. And the Vermin Man was made up of bugs and snakes and rats and all sorts of moving critters. Everything moved. And we had to figure out a way to give Vermin Man a readable face that would stay consistently readable despite the fact that everything in the face was moving. So it took a little bit of work, but we solved it. There are hundreds of thousands of bugs and animals in this creature. So the simulations were massive, just really huge. This is a sequence where Rachel, and you see her right here, is captured by an unseen force and dragged out of an office building, which is destroyed by the force as she's dragged. She's literally pulled right out the side of the building. And Keanu chases after her. This is a miniature. This is not CG. It was a 3rd scale miniature. So if you saw a person's, you couldn't stand up in this space. But it was beautifully detailed. And the building is CG. This was shot on a soundstage, so we didn't get that far away, of course.
Something's coming.
This is the devil. And he smashes the glass out of the windows. You may notice that there's a lot more glass in the air than you could ever imagine from the windows of the doors. That's a movie, you know. And if you ask me where the glass comes from, it comes from the same place the music does.
Or he'd come up here himself to collect.
So I've heard.
That you just seen. So those are some of the shots. And then I'll run through some stills so you get a look at the kinds of things we did as we were making the movie. This is from actually early on in the film production and early on in the script. There's a young woman who is possessed by a demon. There's a demon inside her. And Keanu has to go as Constantin, of course, and he needs to exorcise. He needs to get rid of the demon that's in this young woman and save her life. So this is a sort of typical setup for a scene like this. So you see Keanu there standing in his long black coat. The original Constantin from the graphic novel wears a sort of beige khaki color trench coat. But this is Keanu Reeves. He dresses in black. So the studio and the director decided that the film Constantin would wear a black coat, not a beige coat. So there's Constantin right there. The fellow in the black t-shirt with his back to camera, sitting on the floor in the foreground is Josh McLaughlin. He's the first assistant director. The director, Francis, is in the far corner with his monitor, seeing what the camera sees. And things are being rigged and getting set up. The fellow in the plaid shirt in the left corner is what we call a data wrangler. That fellow worked for me, and he made sure that we had a record of everything the camera had on it and everything it was doing. This was back in the film days. So we're shooting on film. We built a special rig. I designed it and had some people come in, and with the help of my backup effects supervisor, a fellow named Eric Pasquarelli, and we built a dual camera rig that went on both sides of the iris rods of the Panavision camera. And we record the whole scene in a binocular view, which then could be merged, and essentially that meant the camera could see in 3D. That was the first application of any of that technology ever. And it was only used on one other film. And then it all got reinvented years later for a Robert Zemeckis film by a whole other group of people who thought they'd done it for the first time. That's what happens in the film business. The fellow on the far left of frame in the beige shirt is Mark Labange. He was the camera operator. The first assistant camera person is a young woman who's just beyond the camera, sitting on the floor, getting ready to pull focus when necessary. Then the fellow who's rigging the young woman, who's the actor who's going to be played as possessed, is John Rosengrant, and he did makeup effects. So he's getting her set up for the kind of effects that are going to happen in that scene. Then in the background, there's a second assistant director. There's the fellow in the sort of greenish short sleeve shirt that's sort of bent over a little bit is the property master. And there's somebody in the far back. I don't remember who that is. But anyway, you get the idea. That's it. And we took a corner out of the mattress. The grips cut that apart on the day. And that way we could get the camera in looking up at Keanu, and you'll see this shot as it plays out in a minute. I'll show it to you. So you can see why we had to get the camera where it was. This is, if you look at the left edge of frame, in Lost in the Shadow, is a camera, and it's flying on a cable, flying through this conference room set as we triggered all these effects to happen in the conference room. What's happening in the conference room has some physical things. What you see was really happening, but a great deal of it also was digital and added to enhance it. But it's always good to have practical effects, as if you can pull it off and it won't mess up your shooting schedule. Now, I was second unit director on this film, so I was directing this part, and I could do this at the same time that Francis Lawrence was off with the first unit directing his part. So the camera flies through, and here it is a little bit further, and you can see that everything's kind of like this whole conference table blows apart, the chairs go over. The special effects folks had this all rigged to do this. The ceiling has a big slot through it so that the suspension system for the camera can hold it up. And it keeps on going. You can see outside, it's not a green screen. It's what we call a Translight. It's a large transparent still of downtown Los Angeles. And in the end, we removed it because it didn't move in perspective correctly. The camera is moving 20 feet across this room. Those buildings are hundreds and hundreds of feet away. If you move 20 feet closer to a building that's hundreds of feet away, it doesn't change size much at all. But our view, the Translight outside, was only about 30 feet from the windows. So if you move 20 feet towards something that's only 30 feet away, it's going to grow bigger, much faster, and it doesn't look real. So we knew we had to replace it, but it was far too complex a scene. It was going to be easier to rotoscope and create mats for the things we had to do and track the shot and replace the background than if we had a green screen. And then we had to remove all the contamination from the green screen. So looking this way, we didn't have a green screen, but that's a fellow named Tim, and Tim is walking the camera back to its start point so that we can get ready. After we did this pass, we did past with Keanu. We turned the camera around. You can see it's now pointing backwards. And then Keanu, as Constantin, we're carrying what we call the holy shotgun, would run through the scene chasing the camera essentially representing Rachel as she was being pulled out of the building by this unseen force. So we did these, a couple of takes of that, and there's Keanu right now waiting while the cameras prep for another take. We only did 2 or maybe 3 takes, and there's no reason to wear out an actor for a scene like this. Now you see it's all green screen, and that's because if you look the direction the camera was looking toward Keanu, there was no building there. And he had to be running from somewhere. So all the rooms beyond that room had to be built digitally and extended the scene. And we also had to put in the ceiling that was open to a large extent to allow the cables for the camera to carry it back. So there's a camera assistant, looks like he's doing a reload on the camera. The camera was a VistaVision camera, and that's a camera where the magazine is sideways and the film goes through the camera horizontally. And it allows you to capture a frame that's the same size as a SLR frame. And you have much more latitude in post to remove grain, because you're going to have to reduce it. And that means the grain will start to disappear all by itself. So VistaVision was commonly in use for visual effects well into the 2000s. Until we started to get digital cameras that could, replicate their image quality. VistaVision cameras were invented in the 1950s, because television was coming in and movie theaters and film producers were afraid nobody would ever go to a theater again. We won't get into theaters at this point, but anyway, there you are. And then to show you that, yeah, we do use technology, but then sometimes not so much. And this is a scene where a priest who's a friend of Constantin's goes into a liquor store and drinks himself to death in the liquor store. So there's Mark on the camera operator, with a camera that's held onto the dolly by elastic cords, bungee cords is what we call them. And of course, the first assistant director is standing next to Mark, pulling focus. And you can see the hands of the dolly grip way back there, moving the dolly. So very low tech. And but it made a wonderful shot. And it was safe. And this was in a liquor store in a very seedy part of Los Angeles. It was not a set, it was a real location. This is nearby that location at night, and you get an idea of what we're doing. This was, this creature was built by John Rosengrant and the people at Stan Winston Studios, where John was working at the time. And they built a Seplovite, the creatures with no torso, no lower torso, and no legs, so that we had a lighting samples built only for lighting reference. It was not built to be in the movie, but they, being experts at their job, made just a beautiful creature. And so when we finished the scene, we had it on a crane and we brought it into the shot, and the cables coming off it, we just used them to rotate it under the light so that the artist, the visual effects artist, could see what the wings and the skin did under that particular light. So the fellow in the middle of the frame who's talking on a walkie-talkie, and that's why his hand is by his throat, he's clicking his microphone, is talking to the crane operator who's moving this thing through the scene. Then there's Josh, the first assistant director. Josh has been first assistant director on Avatar, Beowulf, Titanic. It just goes on and on. I mean, he's probably the most experienced first assistant director in Hollywood, and one of the most collaborative and cooperative and just as cool as a cucumber. Then there's me, beardless, of course, back then. And next to me in the blue t-shirt is Philippe Rousselot, and the director of photography. And although Philippe and I are good friends, no, we are not related. People see that picture and they always say, you guys, are you cousins or something? Brothers? What are you? No, we just looked alike, except I had more hair than Philippe. So anyway, that was that. It was just for a lighting reference. In the same location, because the camera was up so high and wide, because it was up by the Seplites, we needed to get what's called Chromeball and Grayball reference. So I got a giant Chromeball. That's actually a Christmas ornament for every year in New York. They put up a Christmas tree in Rockefeller Center, and the tree is a gigantic pine tree. I think they're pine trees most of the time. And because you have a gigantic tree, they had to hang gigantic ornaments. And this company makes these things. They're made out of plastic and then plated. So they're very light. They don't weigh anything. And they're highly reflective, like a mirror, as you can see. The purpose of a chrome ball and a gray ball, if you don't know, and it's now turning into ancient technology, but people still use them in slightly modified ways, because we use them to capture high dynamic range images, which we did on this film, but not for this shot. So for this shot, we just had these two people walking through the scene under the light in the same direction that the Seplites are moving. And what you get from this is, if you look at the chrome ball, you can see every light source that's lighting the scene. And chrome balls, spheres, see behind themselves. So if you look at the edges, you're actually looking way down the street on the other side of the street, actually behind these guys at the edges. And then in the center, it's reflecting where the camera is. But that tells you what the source of the light looks like and where it comes from. And you can actually take this sphere and unwrap it and use what's called global illumination with that as your reference source to light the characters you put in the scene. Now, if you create a CG ball and you make it a dull gray color, what we call 18% neutral gray, and you render it under your light that you calculate from the chrome sphere, what you should get is a gray ball that looks just like this one that my friend Chris is holding in the background here. And so you use the information from the chrome ball to light a virtual gray ball, and you compare it to the real one to see if they actually match or even close. And that's how you do it. Now there are many ways to get to the same result. But back then it was chrome ball, gray ball, and some high dynamic range imaging, meaning that we would take stills of these balls at different apertures through a range of, let's say, 10 stops of latitude, sometimes 20, depending on the scene and what we had to do to control lighting. Here we are out in the desert And that's Francis in the green shirt. And we're lining up a shot where a young man is hit by a car, but unlike a normal person who's hit by a car, who would be either knocked somewhere or crushed by the car gets crushed by the person, and then the person just walks away, and the car's left wrecked. This machinery in the front was designed to tow a real car, and that large steel cylinder on the right side of the frame represents the body of the person who's going to be standing there. So the real car was going to be towed by those rams that you see at the bottom of the frame at high speed into this thing. It was going to wrap around, and the goal was to get all the interaction of the car around this fellow's body real, with a real airplane, a real car, and do very little CG in terms of the car. We would replace the human with a digital double, because clearly we couldn't let somebody actually stand there. But things went awry. While we were gone, we were shooting on the set. The special effects guys were building this. I gave them specifications on how big this thing should be, and it wound up 2 or 3 times larger than the actual actor. You can see how big around it is. And compared to the size of the actor, who was about my size, I'm a little guy, it was a real problem, because suddenly we had a lot of machinery we were seeing, and the car was going to wrap around that. So in the end, we had to do digital car stuff anyway, along with the digital actor. But we're prepping the shot, lining up the camera, and this is pretty much where we put it. I don't know where Philippe is. He's usually would be right there with me with the viewfinder, and we'd be setting stuff up. But this was a dialogue between me and Francis, and Mark was there, the camera operator, so he understood stuff. The key grip is in the pinkish reddish shirt, sleeveless shirt. His best boy is in the white shirt next to him. And you can see Josh hovering in the background. And here I am with Philippe. We were out in the desert here, and it was summer. No, it was late fall, actually. It was like November, I think, October. But very, very hot. And so Philippe and I are going over some pre-visualization. A great deal of the film was pre-visualized. And so this was the early days of virtual production. And I'm playing a QuickTime movie of the action we're about to shoot. So Philippe can kind of refresh himself on what the camera is going to be doing, what he has to be doing. And toward the end of the shoot, on the set where you see Francis in the freeway, and he's walking on the freeway, Naomi Shohan, the production designer, built this wonderful freeway set. One thing you should think about is that actors are wonderful. They bring so much to the table, and they have an unbelievable amount of resources to make you believe they're in the place they're in. But if you can, you should do everything you can to help them feel like they're in hell. Now, we could have shot Keanu on a green floor with a green screen behind him, and nothing else. Naomi wouldn't have had to build any of this. But that would have left Keanu and Philippe and Josh and the director always being lost as to where they were and what they were seeing. Because this was in the days, you can see it's 2003, this was in the days before we had real-time composites with virtual backgrounds that were pre-rendered. I didn't start using that technology for another 3 years. That was on Golden Compass. So anyway, this was the pre-visualization we did. And actually what this should be called is post-visualization, because this is the footage of Francis on video and of Keanu on video. And then we'll watch the camera. Oop. It doesn't want to go. Look, a spinning beach ball. Okay, let's go back. All right, let's try it again. There we go. So the camera drops down, goes below the freeway into the masses of people. This is the previs. And then we're out of it. This is what I showed the crew because I directed this scene and we had to make sure everybody understood what was happening because it was going to take 2 or 3 days to make this work. So we had a giant motion control rig. It's called the Bulldog. It's kind of famous and it traveled all on this trailer. And it was basically could be set up, towed onto a soundstage or a location, set up and be ready to go in an hour or less, depending on how much prep time you have. This is what the camera does. And of course, that's the motion. And, you know, it's not a 3D shot movie. It's a 2D movie. It's not shot with 2 cameras or 2 lenses. It doesn't have binocular view. There's no depth. There's a plane where the image exists. So when we populate these things, we don't have to populate outside the frame in any way. We don't have to accommodate a 3D camera, thank goodness. So then I made a floor plan from the pre-visualization, figured out, you can see the cone of the lens with the blue lines. And then it sees all these people that are out there. The studio would only pay for 25 people. And look at the time here. Wow, going very fast. Okay, studio would only pay for 25 people. And so we had a soundstage that got rigged with some set things, again, to help people figure out where they should be and what kind of what the world they're in looks like. The young woman in the foreground is my first assistant director. Her name was Maria. She was the second assistant on first unit. And the fellow she's talking to is the second. And then everybody else is a crew member of one type or another. These were our teaming masses, all 25 of them. And they were coated in this brown earth called Fuller's earth. Very, very fine powdery, like talcum powder. And of course, you can see what happened to the green screen on the floor. So every night for 2 or 3 nights, we had to repaint the entire floor to get it back to green, because by the end of the day, it was as brown as they were. The fellow in the black t-shirt in the back is Eric Pasquarelli. He was my he was the visual effects supervisor who stayed with first unit when I was off directing second unit. And this is the final version of the shot. So then I'll show you this one, and then we may end it. Oops. Sorry. Let's just do this. It needs to run at its own speed. Okay. This was an early cut of that. I'm going to try to speed it along a little bit. There was a dialogue scene in front of these elevator doors before Rachel gets pulled through. That was the miniature, which was not built yet. And that was the camera point of view that you saw before, and that's the reverse angle point of view. You see it just hit the stage wall right there. There was a grip there to catch the camera at the very end because it couldn't go any farther and we didn't want to swing into the wall. And the final version this is straight out of the Avid. So you see we finished it in October. We built a special rig for Rachel so she could be pulled back as you saw her go. And that would help her hold her in position because it's a very difficult position to hold while you're flying back on a track, on a dolly. She was a real trooper. She was great. She's actually in the scene, but as a doll. You can't see her very well. She's lost her. These shots were actually shot with Rachel hanging. We're basically looking up at Rachel here. The green screen is above her, behind her back. And she's hanging with her hair hanging down and her clothes hanging down. All that gravity helped the sense that she was flying that way very fast. And it, you know, as you can see, her hair is being blown. So we go there. And we keep pulling back on the CG building. And we watch Keanu walk off the frame. When you do shots like this, you always have to remember that the shot doesn't end where the camera stops because the camera is going to keep going. And so you have to make sure the actor gives you the full performance. I'll show you this exorcism because this is where we started at the beginning of the talk. I'll end it there and then we'll, because it's already 11 o'clock in Los Angeles. And that means that we're going to be running out of time soon. And I want to make sure we have time for questions and answers. So, so you can see this is the finished shot. This is the daily with the first blocking of animation for the fellow. So the mirror is actually there. So you see that and you see that. We actually had the extras holding up a frame with a lightweight mirror. The mirror is actually plastic, not glass, for safety. And that way we could see her, the young woman who's supposed to be possessed, in the bed, and we could see Keanu and his back, so we could see. And then, of course, we could animate in the creature later. And then we created elements for the creature who would breathe on the glass. So we had to add the creature's breath. You'll see that in a moment. There it is. And then we had to put it all together, and it looked like that. So that's that. And then the rest of these that you've seen. That's more of that. And you've seen that. And this was Rachel about to meet see if I can get there. There he is. Mammon, who is the devil's son. You see him approaching in the background. That was supposed to be a puppet provided by the Stan Winston folks, but originally it was just going to be a shot cut where she turned and his face was right by hers, and it was just that moment. And then Francis decided that you needed to see Mammon approach. So we had to build a digital, rigged, articulated, textured, lit creature that looked like the puppet, even though we never used the puppet, and presented himself like that. And this is the final cut. And I'll get up to where Mammon is. And here he goes, showing up. And then, and that's the devil's son. So, and you know, there's more, but I think we're gonna probably be out of time if I keep going. So I'm going to stop that and stop my share and get back to actually feeling like I'm in a room with somebody. So I think it's, you know, about 8 minutes after the hour, and we have to finish, am I correct, Sam, by in another 20 minutes? Yeah. Well, that's actually a difficult question to answer because the technology is marching forward at such a great rate. What I haven't shown you yet, because I took too long with the Constantin stuff, was some of the current virtual production tools, mostly based on Unreal Engine, the software that was created at Epic Games, that it seems to be the coin of the realm software for doing virtual production. So how do I approach things? If we have a creature or a person, of course, it depends on if it's going to be a person who has to be a photoreal match for the real person who's in the film. That becomes a process of scanning that actor in their wardrobe, but not in their wardrobe, in either a bodysuit or a small, Speedo, swim trunks, that kind of thing, so that we get full confirmation of their body. That will help us have a model for that person. But if it's a creature that, like Mammon, that really isn't human, and that became, that was built by hand by a modeler who was looking at what the Stan Winston people had drawn and built for their Mammon. But their Mammon was really only good from the waist up because it was only for a shot cut like that. So they had to model the entire body. And I have other videos I could show you, which show you that a turntable, one of the first things we do is we model the character. We create some default lighting, which is not very good, but it's fine for what we want. It's very flat. And the person, that character is on a turntable and rotates in front of the camera like that. And we watch the rotation and make sure that everything's right. But along with that, the character has to be rigged. So first, of course, we do the modeling, but the modeling can be now done from photogrammetry using multiple camera views, still camera views of a character. It can be done using structured light, which is a visual scanning technique. It can be done from laser scans of the character that we're trying to replicate. That's if we're trying to copy something that's real. Now, some things that are real, you can't copy. You can't put a lion into a volume and point cameras at it and then hope to get a view from all sides without anything. Lions won't just stand there, and they aren't really cooperative. The same with any large predator animal. They're not there. Then the modeling becomes one based on photographs and research and studying, and we have CG modelers who build them. But the most important step, obviously the modeling is important because you want to get the look right, you want to make sure the size is right, you want to make sure it has all the elements that are needed to help tell the story, because all of this is driven by the story. So then you have this creature, but the creature can't move. It's a chess piece. It's a solid thing, not solid, of course, because it's CG, but it's got a surface and it sits there and won't move. So you have to create all of the inner workings for that creature that creature would have. So it has a skeleton, it has joints, it has muscles, it has fat, it has skin. And all of these are represented by layers with different controls. Some of them are procedural, in which case, let's say you have a gorilla, and it's an older gorilla, and he's moving across like this, just walking slowly, something from Planet of the Apes, one of the older animals, the orangutans with the big bellies. And that belly is swaying because it's so large and there's so much fat there. That swaying belly can be procedurally animated. Its motion can be driven by the overall motion of the animal to a wonderfully believable extent. So you don't have to have somebody keyframing where the belly is going to be at what frame. It can be tied directly to the motion of the animal. One of the great inventions for animating CG characters was the invention of inverse kinematics, where if you take a foot and you move it forward with inverse kinematics, the whole leg, the hip, everything moves as it should to get that leg forward. It knows how to do it. That's called it's a technique, and it's called inverse kinematics. So it's basically, we move our feet because the control comes from the brain and runs down through our spine to our feet. And our brain says, pick up that foot and put it out there, or you're going to fall over. Now pick up and with the other foot and put it out further, or else you're going to fall over. Because walking is a process of falling forward in a controlled manner. So that's normal kinematics. That's forward kinematics, because that's how people move. But if you want to animate them, that's painstaking to say, okay, well, I take the femur and I move it like this, and I take the lower leg and I do this, and I take the foot and the ankle, and you start doing all of that, and it doesn't look right. And then you're spending literally weeks reanimating this character to you have all the right stuff rigged, but you don't have the proper kinematics. You don't have the proper motion. But software can be written so that if you take the foot and you move it from point A to point B, then all of the connecting body parts that would control that foot are moved procedurally by software so that the leg appears to be moving the foot. But it's really driven inversely. You're moving the foot first. The brain has nothing to do with it. So it's an incredible tool. It also can be a real dangerous tool. It can make characters look very rubbery. And back in the early 2000s, you saw that example a lot. Late 90s, early 2000s, because we didn't have any way to control that at that point. And there were issues with digital camera shutters versus practical camera shutters. And the motion sometimes just didn't look real because of motion blur issues and because the inverse kinematics started to make the character look kind of ropey, as if the bones were bending. And they weren't, but it looked that way. I used to call it the tyranny of inverse kinematics. So the animator could see that, of course, and fix it. So it was remediable. You could remedy it. But anyway, that's how much of that was done. Now, of course, if you're creating an actor who really exists, you scan that actor, you create a model of that actor, as I described, and you motion capture the actor. You bring the actor into a motion capture volume and have the actor do what you wanted the actor to do on the set, but they couldn't because it was too dangerous to put anybody, let alone an actor, in that situation. Sucker Punch had a number of those kinds of shots. So you get the animation about 80, 90% of the way there by doing motion capture. And there's two aspects of motion capture. There's what we call motion capture, which is getting the gross motion of the character through the scene, whatever that is. Now, of course, it's wonderful for stunts, and stunt people thought it was going to put them out of business. But of course, you need stunt people to perform on the motion capture stage so we can capture the stunt. We can just do it much more safely than if we had to do it in front of a motion picture camera. So we motion capture the stunt or the actor. We apply that motion to the character that we built. And if the character is properly rigged, and rigging is an art in itself. Rigging a character means finding all the places where you need to have control over what that character is doing. And it can be a bicep muscle on a young Arnold Schwarzenegger digital version from a Terminator movie. It could be eyelids, it can be eyeballs, it could be lips, nose. You know, bears have more muscles controlling what their nose is doing than what controls the rest of their face. And so you have to create all of that so you can get that kind of wonderful expressiveness that bears have by squishing their nose around. And if you do your job right, you can do a pretty credible version of a real character. So now a lot of it is done by scanning or photogrammetry or whatever to capture the character, if it's a real character. Modeling very carefully from photographs and video reference. If it's a character that you can't scan, you know, like an ape or something highly poisonous that you don't want to get near, or snakes, maybe you don't want to do that. And you're certainly not going to get them to hold still for a scan. You do the rig, and the rig is critically important. And a bad rig can just destroy your motion capture and make it look terrible. So the rig has got to be as good as your motion capture or better so that it feels real. And this happens all the time. You take the raw data of motion capture, you watch it move as a very low res model across the frame, and it looks great. And then you apply that to your rigged model, and suddenly it looks terrible. And it's the rig that's constraining the model, so you have to fix that. So there's these steps of modeling, and of course, meanwhile, you're texturing and creating attributes and growing hair or fur for that animal. Deciding how to model an animal that's furry is a major process because the fur obscures a great deal of the geometry of a character. So because we're building the character, it's not a real character, we have to decide how much of that shape is in the geometry and how much of the shape actually comes from the way the fur grows. So sometimes the models actually look a little bit different than what a real, a tiger, the bald tiger might look a little bit different than the furred up tiger, because the furred up tiger has to look real. But the bald tiger just has to be built to make it look real. There's a very famous computer graphics, American computer graphics scientist named James Blinn. He's now up at Microsoft. And James is famously quoted as saying, it does not have to be real, it just has to look real. And that's the trick of all of this stuff, is that if you try to make it be real, you will almost certainly fail. There are just too many things in reality. And of course, with a human, you go into that place that we call the uncanny valley, where the creature is so close to looking real, but not quite there. And it looks creepy and you don't believe it, and you're immediately taken out of the story. And we are, in the last 12 months and going forward now, well past that kind of not well past it, but we're past it. If I had a few minutes, hold on a second. Yeah, okay. I'm going to just show you some stills here real quickly. First, I've got to open them. There they are. And I have to share the screen again. And there's the screen. And share. And you should be seeing an extreme close-up of a young man with a sketchy beard and hair and an eyeball. And hope you can confirm that with me, but that's what you should be seeing. And that's a digital character. This digital character was rendered in real time with new software from Unreal, Epic Games. This person is a digital character. That person is a digital character. These are wholly constructed characters. They have no basis in reality. There's nobody that looks like this. They didn't take a photograph of that person and copy it and project the photograph onto the geometry. They didn't do any of those tricks. This is all built from scratch, and it's animatable and renderable in real time. Hair blowing, deformations, liquid in the eyes. None of these have open mouths, but even their teeth look really good. And teeth are a real problem with this stuff. So, okay, I'm stop the share. Those are metahumans. That's what they call them at the Epic Games. So it gives you an idea of that's where we are now with this sort of thing. And of course, it takes a huge amount of planning and time. So a great deal of what we used to do in post, we now do before we ever shoot the movie. We create these characters so they can actually be animated in real time on the set and composited and combined with the live action footage that you're capturing, so that the director of photography and the director and the actors and everybody have a complete sense of the scene they're in. So it's almost like being in a real place with a real other person, but it isn't a real other person, it's a digital person. Of course, this is scary stuff because these people look pretty real. And if you go to the Unreal Engine website, there's a link to MetaHumans, and you can see their demo reel for MetaHumans. So you see all these guys moving, because these are just frame grabs that I pulled from the videos, and it's amazing, especially because it renders in real time. So you can imagine if you need a little bit more detail, but you're working on a feature film, you don't have to render it in real time. You can render the lower, if you need it on the set, you can take out some of the things that slow down the render and get to real time. But then you can put them in to finish the movie and come with some wonderful and real performances. So anyway, does that help? That's kind of, I could talk about this stuff for days. I don't know how to. Okay, I can tell you how I work. I can't tell you every visual effects supervisor on a motion picture that has a fairly major amount of visual effects has their specific approach to how they work with the director. But the first thing I do, and you got a sample of that from Francis, the dialogue between me and Francis at the beginning of Constantin. It's one of the reasons I show this reel. When I was first hired, Francis said, "What do you want to do first?" And I said, "I want to sit down with you and the production designer." That was Naomi Shohan. "And I want the three of us to sit in a room and go through the script page by page so that we all, Naomi and I, really understand where you think the important things are and where you think things can be downplayed, maybe aren't quite so important. And so we can feel the weight of how we should be looking at things. And then we can also talk about the way you feel about, like in Constantin, it said there were these demons from hell, but it didn't describe them. So I asked Francis what he thought they were like. And he had photographs of cadavers and all kinds of things that, kind of inspired us to create the demons that are in the movie. So you go through it, the script, that took 2 or 3 days with Francis to go through it page by page and really deeply discuss everything. By the end of that time, this is usually before the director of photography is hired. Producers generally don't like this because they want to be in the room while we're having this discussion. They want to get the bad news early, but we're not talking about bad news. We're talking about story and character and how do we tell the best story possible. And it's too soon to have a producer in that dialogue because they will always be worried about how you're going to do it and how much it's going to cost. And we don't know at that point. All we know is that's what's important to the director. And that's what we need to be able to represent on the screen. And so those 3 days are crucial. And those 3 days are what established the look of hell. They established the look of the Seplobites. They established the look of other creatures in the film, the demons. I mean, we didn't do the final design there, of course, but we had a real good idea what they were supposed to be like. Naomi could show her drawings of what she thought hell looked like. I could talk about the nuclear blasts and the thermal wave that came through. And that's how I established the relationship with the director. And because we're going to be elbow by elbow next to each other for the next 2 years. And we can't be trying to interpret what the other one is saying. We have to be clear with each other. And if you get in a situation where you don't have that clarity, it's either not going to work or you're not going to keep your job. Or the director won't keep their job because they're not being clear. If they're not being clear with us, they're not going to be clear with the producers of the studios or whatever. So anyway, I hope I'm answering the question, but at the beginning, you work really intensely on how the visual effects can help tell the story. That's my job. My job is to support the story in every way possible. Wow, Blade Runner. Blade Runner was a long time ago. I didn't work on the new one. I worked on the original one. It was incredibly challenging from the very first minute I showed up there. I was actually an art director on that film, but I wasn't in the art directors union. So my credit, I was called the action prop supervisor. They invented a credit that didn't violate any union contracts. And what I did is I was responsible for the Voight-Kampff machine that you see initially in the movie when Harrison Ford is interviewing Sean Young, who plays Rachel. And the arm comes up and there's a little video screen and she's looking into that ocular device, which was based on the very center of it was a Norelco shaver head, and the little parts came off that. And I worked with the team, and I actually built myself the bellows that went up and down at the top of the, on the top of the Voight-Kampff machine. Underneath the table, there was a special effects guy with a wire rod, and he would do this while he listened to the dialogue, so the bellows would move in response to the words being spoken. We actually had a voice actuated device, which we built. We had 4 days from absolutely nothing to having this thing ready and on the set. So we worked around the clock for 4 days. And then we were supposed to do a similar thing with the inside of the car on that film. I was supposed to have 6 weeks to build the inside of the car, make it computer controlled, do all these kinds of things. That was fine, except that we didn't get 6 weeks, we had 9 days. And so my crew of 12 people worked around the clock for 9 days until we were all hallucinating, and they took the car away from us and they put it on the set and they shot it. So Blade Runner for me was, first of all, getting in the groove with Ridley Scott was difficult. Not real, for me, it wasn't particularly difficult. As soon as I showed the Voight-Kampff machine, and he looked at it and said some words I probably shouldn't say politely, but they were meant as compliment. He loved it, and he wanted it. So that was great. That established me with Ridley as somebody who shared his vision. But Ridley said he was quoting Alfred Hitchcock when he said to me, continuity is for sissies. Continuity is not important. Telling the story is really important. And if the audience can follow the story, it doesn't matter if the inside of the car doesn't look like it's a different car than the car he's really sitting in. You're doing inserts, which is what we were doing one day. And he asked me to shoot some inserts of the inside of the car with a hand pushing buttons and some other things. And I said, Ridley, it won't match. And he said, continuity is for sissies. And of course, it didn't match and nobody cared. Blade Runner was, for me, was different because I was on the production side of things and I wasn't on the show in post-production. I was actually trying to get a film produced. And then I went to work on War Games. So I didn't have anything to do with the post-production of Blade Runner. But I had to be very careful because whenever we shot the inside of the car and the people in the car, the environment was going to have to go outside. And I worked with Doug Trumbull and his team, David Dreyer, to make sure that the photography of the car was going to work in the movie. So that's Blade Runner. And then the other one, question was Avatar. Avatar, the problems were, it's a very large movie. And it had a large group of people around Jim Cameron that he had brought along and trusted to be the ones who would talk to us and get us to do the right things. Now, there were times when we would sit, these were all, this was 2009, 2010. These were all virtual meetings. We would sit in our editing room. Jim would be in his editing room, miles and miles away. And he'd be reviewing shots. We would have those shots delivered to his editing room. It was usually quicker to run a drive out there than it was to actually send a file. We didn't have a super fast pipe to Jim's editing room. It just depended on what our time frame was. And he would review the shots with us. So we'd be in our place, he'd be in theirs. We'd look at the same footage at the same time, and he'd make notes. And the biggest problem was not a technical problem or an artistic problem. The problem was that quite often the people who were working for him were really being interpretive. And they would sit in this room, and I was essentially in the room too, and my crew was essentially in the room. And we heard him speak, and they heard him speak, and they heard something entirely different than what we heard. So then they would meet with us afterward and say, this is what you need to do. And I or Chris Bond, who was the sort of day-to-day supervisor on the show, or I was sort of the overall supervisor and the front man with Jim, because I knew Jim and we were friendly and I could talk to him. And they were kind of counting on me to make sure that everything looked good. So we would hear from these people that worked for Jim, and they would tell us, in all earnestness, they were not lying. They weren't trying to make their own movie. They literally heard it differently, and they would say to us what Jim wanted, and we would say, no, that's not what he's asking for. What he's asking for is this. And they said, don't do that. Do this. So we learned that we had to do both versions, twice as much work. So we would do two versions, the version that we thought Jim wanted, and then the version that they wanted. And sometimes we'd do a third version, which is the version we wanted because we thought it was maybe even better for the film than what Jim wanted. But we never showed him anything new unless we showed him what he wanted first. But then we would go to a screening and we would show Jim a shot and he would lose it. He's famous for his temper, and he would yell and say, what the hell is this? This is not what I said. This isn't what I wanted. This isn't what, and it was every single time it was the version that was done according to the way his team was describing it to us. And they were there. They approved it to be shown to Jim. So they knew, but they never said anything. And I didn't say anything. And I said, well, we have this other version, Jim, you want to see it? And he'd say, sure. So we'd put up the other version and go, that's what I'm talking about. That's what we need. And I'd say, well, if you like this, you might like this, which is like that, but we did this other thing. And I do it. And sometimes he'd say, oh, no, don't go that far. This is good. Or then he'd say, that's terrific. Oh man, that's great. Do more of that. And then everybody was happy. So it's learning the language of just about everybody who's involved with the show. Directors of photography, production designers, grips, assistant directors, everybody. Visual effects people, work with every department on a film. And they have to be empathic. They have to be sympathetic to everything that everybody needs. You know, on Golden Compass, the costume designer showed me a coat that was going to be worn by Nicole Kidman in a number of scenes. It was a fur coat. And Nicole Kidman, at one point in the planning for the movie, was going to have to be a digital character for some stuff. And that meant she was going to have a fur coat, a digital fur coat. And I said to the, and it was a huge amount of work for very little time on screen for the digital coat. Practical coat had more time. So to do a digital fur coat was hugely expensive. To build it, to rig it, because the coat has to be rigged, it has to have, you know, cloth dynamics. It's furry, it has to be lit like fur, it has to be rendered like fur, it has to do all those sorts of things. It's, you know, it's as difficult as doing a very furry animal, sometimes even more difficult. So I said to the costume designer, this is really going to give us a problem. We're going to have trouble with this. And it's going to cost a huge amount of money, but we only need it in 3 shots. So maybe you can you give her a coat that you like, that you want to bring to the director, that doesn't have fur everywhere. Maybe a fur collar, fine, you know, something small that we can control very easily. And she agreed, and she made this wonderful coat for Nicole Kidman, which never shows up in the movie at all, by the way. And that became that. You have to understand what they're going through and how they need that character. Marty Scorsese said, costume is character. And if you talk to any actor, they will say, you know, Harrison Ford said, I didn't know I was Indiana Jones till I put the hat on, right? He put on that hat and he was that character. And other actors say that all the time. I really didn't understand who that character was until I dressed like the character. So costume designers have a huge role in making a successful movie and making sure the actors are comfortable. I don't want to mess with that, but I also have to be protective of how we spend our money, and I have a producer who actually spends the money, but I don't want to suddenly load her with $500,000 worth of work that's going to be in 3 shots in the movie. That's just not worth it. You know, we got better places to spend that money. So there, I think. Okay, well, I do want to thank the class. Thank you for hanging in and listening to me blather on for the last hour and a half or more. I really appreciate it. And I hope you saw some interesting things. And if any of you travel to Los Angeles or care to get in touch, you can look me up on the directory in the University of Southern California. And I appreciate it very much. This is great fun. Thank you.
Майкл, большое спасибо. Это было очень интересно, очень познавательно. Вот, для тех, кто досмотрел наш мастер-класс до конца и рассматривает обучение в нашей киношколе, мы подготовили для вас подарок. А это скидка 10% на первый семестр по любой из наших программ. Вот, весеннего набора этого года. Так что для бронирования скидки вам необходимо оформить заявку на нашем сайте. И с настоящего момента до конца этой недели. Вот, так что, как говорится, не откладывайте на завтра то, что можно сделать сейчас. Вот еще раз огромное спасибо всем участникам мастер-класса. Будем рады вас видеть на других наших мастер-классах Школы кино и телевидения «Индустрия», который регулярно проходит по пятницам, но сегодня у нас был в четверг. Так что заходите на наш сайт, регистрируйтесь и добро пожаловать в индустрию. Всем еще раз огромное спасибо, кто присутствовал на этом мастер-классе.